Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest BWD Boardroom live event. This is the rearranged event from 2 weeks ago, and for those of you who logged on to that, you would have seen a rather cringeworthy game of charades taking place. You may have spotted Justin and the other panelists doing "I can see you, but I can't hear you," and my best rendition of "Oh great, the bloody sound isn't working, what do we do now?" So anyway, back to today, we're tackling the somewhat spicy topic of the FCA with a particular focus on charges and fees. We've got a very snappy title of FCA Fees, Time for Action. Clearly, whoever wrote that should be working in advertising and not recruitment. As a precursor to today's debate, we have been running a poll on LinkedIn asking people whether they think the FCA is fit for purpose. And the results of that are that 46% of people said yes, it was, and 54% of people said no, it wasn't. So the no's have it. The no's have it. I suspect we'll delve into some of this opinion very shortly. Now, we know that this is a very emotive subject, which has had its fair share of press over the years, most of which has been written by our chair, Justin Cash, who, as we know, is the editor of Money Marketing. We're very fortunate to have Justin chairing proceedings today, so we're in very safe hands. And without further ado, over to you, Justin.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Alistair. Am I coming through all right for everyone? I should double check after last time.
Yes.
Fabulous. A very warm welcome to everyone. Thanks, BWD, for having me and for throwing us the extremely low-hanging fruit that is bashing the regulator for an hour. Apologies if you tried to tune into the session a few weeks ago. Again, very glad that the first time I've ever seen WebEx fail was during a panel I happened to be chairing. I believe they call that a hospital pass in a game of rugby. Anyway, ever since I took over here at Money Marketing, FCA fees have been a topic that just comes up over and over again. Those voices just keep getting louder. In a world of grey areas, the advice profession, it seems, has decided to agree on one thing at least: enough is enough. Whenever we get the chance to grill the FCA or FSCS on this, the answer is always pretty straightforward. The old lady of Stratford is not for turning. Let's see if our brilliant panel have any insight that can help them change their mind. With me today, we have Nick Bamford from Informed Choice Financial Planning, Dave Robinson from Centurion Chartered Financial Planners, former FCA man Phil Deeks, now part of KPMG's Regulatory Insights team, and Mike Barrett from the Lancat. Just a couple of quick housekeeping points before we get going. Please do ping over your questions as and when they crop up. I'll do my best to weave them into our discussion, but we'll have a dedicated Q&A at the end of the panel as well. We want this to be lively, engaging, so don't be shy. Throw a grenade in or two as well. You can even ask me what I think if you fancy. It's a bit of a mastermind topic for me, so I'm not afraid to wade in when required. Let's get the ball rolling. The premise of our chat today, given its title, seems to be that it's time for action on FCA fees. So I'm going to ask each panelist in turn, what action would they take? Let's start with one of our illustrious advisors. Nick, what's gone wrong, and do we have a solution?
It's gone wrong. I think we can all agree on that. You only have to look at the progression of the cost and the challenges of acquiring professional indemnity insurance. If you look at the way in which financial services compensation scheme levies have increased over the last decade, and I've done an analysis of this in respect of our own business, it's just ridiculous. It really has reached the point where you can't budget for these things too easily because you just simply don't know what's going to happen. So when you get an increase in PI cover of 41% in a year and FSCS levies of 72%, you start to come to the conclusion, quite rightly, that the system somehow is broken. Is there a solution? Well, it's not the kind of solution that the FCA seem capable of coming up with, because their solution seems to revolve around getting more professional indemnity insurance. Philip Deeks, you did that survey, 80% of IFAs now saying that they'll struggle to get affordable or even get cover next year. So the FCA solution is get more of that cover, pay more for it. I wonder, and I'll finish in a second, promise, whether they've actually bothered to do any back testing on the ideas that they've got. So they came up with 3 items in the call for input. Have they actually bothered to go back over the last decade and see what those changes would have done in practice? I doubt that very much. I'll shut up now.
Well, that's a good point to bring Simon in, actually, because as a PIMFA man yourself, you've been at the coalface of lobbying and chatting to the FCA, helping form its thoughts on this. Have they looked at the history? What has been their feedback when you've raised challenges to them?
So I think, sorry, can you hear me? I'm talking through very bad headphones. So I think it's an interesting question, and I think one of the more frustrating things is that no one really knows the answer to it, right? And I think it's important when we talk about FCA fees that we sort of have to decouple 2 sort of aspects, right? Everybody sort of agrees that sort of rising FSCS levies, rising PII cover, rising FCA fees are fundamentally a bad thing. But it strikes me that we've sort of been asking the wrong question for the last sort of 5 years or so. That question sort of being, well, how do I pay my fair share? When really, I think the question we should be asking is, why does the bill continue to rise on a year-on-year basis for the industry as a whole? And that sort of leads to a broader sort of solution. And I think that solution is sort of twofold. The first is a more effective and targeted regulatory regime in which the FCA is sort of able to identify harm that is arising in the market and prevent it from happening before it crystallizes and falls onto the FCA. And the second is the extent to which the existence of the FSCS provides a level of market distortion, allowing firms to essentially sell their liabilities onto the scheme and continue operating as they did beforehand through the provision of phoenixing and through the provision of CNCs, etc. There isn't an easy and quick solution, and that's sort of why I kind of feel like for the last few years we've been focusing on the construction of the levy, because if you change the construction of the levy, then all of a sudden your bill might go down next year. But what happens in 3 years' time when harm continues to happen and your share continues to rise as a result? There is no sort of quick and easy answer, but it is ultimately, to my mind, a question of better, more targeted regulation.
We've seen a bit of moving of the deck chairs, with providers picking up more of the tab after the last review. But Phil is another man very familiar with the regulations about this. Is that kind of deck chair moving enough, or should we be going down Simon's route of really addressing the fundamental causes of the harm here?
I think what we've seen with the regulator with that concession is probably about as far as they're going to go in terms of spreading that liability that sits in intermediation onto providers. And I think we've seen the regulator come out saying, and I sense as well, we're not going to see anything seismic happen in the fundamental framework within which fees and levies operate. But then I think a lot of it is back to what Simon was saying, is about that fair allocation. There's a couple of things happening here that are kind of quite helpful in terms of there seems to be lots of activity within the regulators, them looking at themselves, the Treasury as well taking a different view about kind of their accountability. So I think now's quite a good time for the advisor community to come together and kind of coalesce around this. There's a number of different open consultations, whether it's around PI cover, whether it's around fees and levies, or the broader call for evidence. I think kind of in terms of actions for firms, I think it's to coalesce around a common issue, which again, we're going to hear loud and clear today, and engage with the regulator on this. The FSCS have also come out and kind of admitted advisor firms are paying more than their fair share. So I think we've got both FCA and FSCS in listening mode. So if we can kind of engage, identify some proportionate and pragmatic ideas and potential solutions, perhaps we'll explore some further today. I think now is quite a good opportunity for certainly this discussion, and to then push that forward in terms of engaging with both regulator and FSCS.
Dave, as an advisor, do you think that the FCA really is in listening mode? Are you and others prepared to go to them and hammer the message home some more?
I would hope so. I mean, there's quite a lot of stuff in the press at the moment about how they are now beginning to open up, and I absolutely agree with Phil. I think the way forward is dialogue and engagement. Certainly in the past, I have gone to them directly on a number of issues and really had no response back at all. Because fundamentally, I think even when you try and help the regulator, it doesn't even listen. And where I come back to, it's probably no secret that I get involved in quite a bit of expert witness work. And I certainly have come across several cases that I think are bang to rights examples of very, very poor financial advice. And I've taken for many, many years the sort of stance that stamping out bad practice is in our interest. It absolutely is. And I am very strong and use any opportunity to try and flag it up and try and do something about it, because I am not at all surprised where we've ended up. To me, it's a logical conclusion. There are all sorts of unintended consequences going on here, which no doubt we'll go into. But one of the biggest frustrations I've got is even when you try and help FOS and point out bad practice, very little happens to stamp it out. One of the huge things that frustrates me is phoenixing. Couple of strikes, you should be out. Everybody perhaps should be given one opportunity, but I'd even say that depends on circumstances. But I think what hugely disappoints me is the way that sometimes bad practice is actually ignored by the regulator, even when people like me flag it up, and I'm not the only one who flags it up. And secondly, even when they find it themselves, they actually don't really do very much about it. The fundamental frustration is that the good guys are paying the bill for the bad guys, and the bad guys are becoming fewer and further between. And one of the really unintended consequences that I'm quite concerned about is that it is hugely difficult now to start up a financial advice firm. Nick alluded to it. It's hugely difficult to find PI cover for a startup. Costs are going up dramatically. We've had exactly the same experience as Nick on that in our business. We are of a size where we can cope with it. It's fine. But the end result of all of this is very smaller practitioners are finding it very difficult, totally disillusioned, probably advancing retirement. This, particularly from a cost perspective, is causing an awful lot of consolidation. Now, the end result is, if you look at accountancy, where I came from, and the law, the vast majority of firms in those fields are in the middle tier. Where we are is huge numbers of very small firms, which I don't think are particularly good for practitioners or clients, or even commercially, or very, very big consolidators. I certainly do not think that large-scale consolidation backed by venture capital or debt is in a client's best interest. This is a massive unintended consequence of this current issue with costs that I'm hugely concerned about. In my view, not fit for purpose. I've tried to help in very small ways where I can, but I've found a bit of a stone wall. I am really hoping that they are actually thinking about dialogue now they've realised how serious the problem is.
Mike just unmuted himself. I think he wants to jump in.
No, someone did that for me. It was magic. Yeah, Alistair's put his hand up. Just checking to see how I'm awake. I think on this subject, we tend to kind of always try to look at things from the point of view of the end customer and kind of what's going through in their mind and what's important to them. Certainly, there's a question around kind of the overall cost of investing, the cost of accessing advice, and whether that's value for money. And when you break that down into kind of the different elements, not many platforms are making a profit. So if they are trying to rip people off there, they're not doing a particularly good job of it. If you look at the advice sector, the broadly revenues are going up, but the profits against those revenues are falling because of all the reasons which we just talked about. So there isn't kind of any kind of real kind of systemic issues of ripping people off from a value for money point of view from the advice sector. If you look at the asset management sector, they're consistently generating profits in the region of 36% average across the industry, which is about double any other sector of industry commerce that you could care to think of. So I think if it's a problem in terms of value for money, you point the finger elsewhere. But again, looking at it from a consumer's point of view, part of the value they get from working with a regulated advisor is that there is that safety net there, that if something goes wrong, they are able to access address. And absolutely, that's hugely important, I think, for that to happen from the consumer's point of view. Very simplistically, you could say if there was no dodgy advice going on, no dodgy issues there, then there wouldn't be any need for any payouts and the levies would drop. But that, as I say, that's oversimplistic. I think where the financial planning community needs to take action, and they sadly have a very fragmented and quiet voice in this space, is that, yeah, there are a number of good guys. If I earned enough at the Landcat, I would come and see many of the people on this panel to do some financial planning with, because I know they have good reputations. But that voice doesn't get across. And I think the regulator understands that there is this core of good guys there, and they're being let down by the scumbags around them, both in and outside of the regulatory perimeter. You only have to cast your mind back to kind of January and February this year, where the regulator was kicking off the assessing suitability 2 work. A number of firms had some fairly lengthy questionnaires around exactly how suitable the advice is and all the rest of that. The regulator had that data and has that data and has decided to defer indefinitely the further work on that subject. So they must have looked at that data and decided within the financial advice community that we see there isn't a problem there that requires us to take further action. So it's about the people, as I said, on the edge of the perimeter. It's about the scumbags who are unregulated, who frankly couldn't care less. Well, it's like the police saying, stop to a burglar, don't rob my house because that's illegal. The burglar's going to carry on doing it because he doesn't care what's going on. And a lot of these people don't care what the regulator says to them because they're scumbags.
That point you made about the end consumer is a very interesting one that I want to pick up and open up to everyone. It's the refrain that you hear from the SCS is, well, if this protection wasn't there, then people wouldn't use financial advice as much, that this helps engender trust, that they know if it goes wrong, that they can be compensated for it. Therefore, more people have the confidence to invest. Do we really think that's how it works? Do we really think people wouldn't go to financial advice if the safety net wasn't there or at a level that it currently is?
I don't think that's necessarily true. I certainly I don't think any of the clients that we deal with come to us because there is a compensation scheme available. They come to us as they would any professional, expecting us to provide a proper professional service that actually produces a benefit to them. I think fundamentally I'd take a sort of slightly perhaps different view on this. I grew up in accountancy. I practiced as a chartered accountant for 10 years before I did this. And I can remember when I got into financial advice, as Nick will probably remember, 30 odd years ago, it was like the Wild West. There is no doubt we've come on a long way since then. But fundamentally, people perhaps do not trust financial advisors. I think there are a huge range of people out there that could benefit from financial advice, but they are literally scared of consulting a financial advisor, and I've got various different ways I've tested that, simply as at social events, when you meet someone you've never met before, what do you do for a living? Well, sometimes I say I'm a chartered accountant, in which case, actually, boring as it may be, it sort of starts a conversation. But if I say I'm a financial advisor, people will back away. You can physically see them do it. if I say I'm a chartered financial planner, that actually, oh, what's that? That's not financial advice, is it? You know, so it's really interesting. But you know, the fundamental or one fundamental part of being a profession to me is it should be trusted by people to the extent it should be trusted to self-regulate. You know, that probably is an absolute dream and utopia, but we're way away from that yet. And I think still the regulator and people, most of them probably veer on the side of not trusting us as opposing to trusting us. It's really strange the regulator takes that view, in my view, but it does. I don't think people take financial advice in the expectation they're going to be falling back on a compensation scheme. If they did, they wouldn't take the advice in the first place, surely.
Mm.
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily the case that people don't trust financial advisors. I think it's a broader question of the fact that people don't really trust financial services. And one of the interesting things about the compensation scheme is that it doesn't really work for the purposes of financial advice, because its provenance, its beginning was actually that of a sort of deposit protection scheme, which, you know, doesn't really apply. Like in the end, if somebody sort of, you know, gets a bad outcome, the likelihood is that they're not going to lose all of their money. They might sort of lose a portion and they can fall back on the compensation scheme. But I do think that whilst it isn't a conscious decision to access a financial advisor because you have access to the compensation scheme, the fact that it does exist is a very sort of useful kind of input. But I quite like to pick up on Dave's point about sort of self-regulation, because to my mind, I think the regulator accepts that a lot of the industry does actually self-regulate. And we see that in the lived experience of the vast majority of firms, right? As trade body for financial advice and wealth management, you know, our largest firms are regulated by call center. They don't have a one-to-one relationship with the supervisor in the way in which, for example, a large bank does. I mean, how many financial advisors do you know that get a regular sort of phone call or knock on the door from the regulator? It doesn't really happen, because whilst, you know, this sector is extremely important in the grand schemes of financial services, it's actually sort of a very sort of small proportion of the universe that the regulator actually sort of has supervision over.
Yeah, that's true, Simon. But do you not think philosophically that the regulator actually starts from the perspective of not trusting financial advisors?
So, and my view is, and this is based solely on conversations that actually sort of reasonably recently we had, and sorry to sort of name drop, with sort of Megan Butler and sort of Charles Randall, is that they accept that the vast majority of financial advisors in the space do the right thing, do their absolute best to do the right thing, and in some circumstances where they haven't done so because they've made a conscious decision not to, just because they haven't had the capability or the training to do so, they'll point to the fact that 8 years ago, the suitability of advice was just over sort of 50, early 60%, and now it's well over 90%. And that isn't because of good regulation. That's just because financial advisors are just much better at their jobs than they were, right? They're better trained, they're more professional. It's a profession now, whereas beforehand it wasn't. And the regulator would be the first person to sort of say that. Maybe they should say it in public more often.
And picking up on Dave's point and your point there, Simon, which is, okay, self-regulation may be kind of the utopia, but I think the direction of travel from the regulator is towards that. We're seeing the regulator move away from worrying about the prescription of the rules and in the detail. They're talking about outcomes. They're talking about culture. They're talking about purpose. Now, clearly, if you've got a firm that's set up to do good and it's trying to do the best thing by its customers, by proxy, it will meet most of the regulatory requirements that sit underneath it. And that's why I think we're seeing the regulator kind of take a step up, give firms probably the benefit of the doubt, but also from their perspective, on the basis they do have limited resources, actually supervising a firm based on the culture and the purpose is quite an effective supervisory model. If I can use data, I can understand what the business proposition is. Do you use unregulated introducers? Do you put lots of stuff in esoteric investments? I can form a view quite quickly. What's the culture of those firms? And actually, I could draw quite a big, large net around the vast swathe of advisors out there saying, they're the good guys. They fit the characteristics of having the right culture, appropriate controls, they've got accountability. I can then focus more of my time and effort on the more nefarious, those in and around the perimeter.
Yeah. We've got our first question in from the audience, so thanks very much for that. It's one from David Owen. Are our biases blinding us from the obvious issues? For example, portfolio building and charging for it. We're creating small-scale DFMs is just for the revenue. We're using phrases like DA and IFA as if that excuses best practice. So I basically take this as, we're saying that there's only this very small amount of people who are rogues, but with the growth of consolidator and vertically integrated models that are owning a lot of the value chain, it might be suitable advice, quote unquote, but people aren't getting great outcomes, and that's part of the issue.
I think, from my mind, I think that feels like a second-tier issue. I think where we've got firms off the back of pension freedoms, off the back of pension transfers, doing stuff fundamentally flawed, fundamentally in breach of regulation, I think it feels right that that's where the regulator's first view is. I absolutely agree. Once you get past that, then the focus is on value for money, is on outcomes. I think kind of the first order issue the regulator's worried about is customers being exposed to scams, receiving unregulated advice, being put in unregulated investments. That feels to me like a first tier issue.
My comments earlier about back testing, I think Philip's making a good point here, which is if you look at scams and you look at unregulated investments, how much of the cost over the last decade has been attributable to those kind of activities rather than the kind of activity we heard described earlier, where simply there was a mistake made or a standard wasn't as good as it should have been. And I just have a feeling that the huge burden of cost and the reason why FSCS levies are where they are, PI is where it is because of those activities. It's not because a firm has made a couple of errors, because you'd expect their professional indemnity insurance to have covered them for that. So I think it must be that chasing of commissions through unregulated products or out and out scams. I mean that's where the focus, and I agree with Philip, that's where the regulatory focus ought to be, because everybody can make mistakes. That's not that's accepted. But the vast majority of firms that I know an awful lot of IFAs and financial planning firms, they don't set out to scam their clients. They don't set out to sell them products that are unsuitable. It's the majority of us who are paying huge costs for those firms who are doing the kind of things that we know are wrong.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Nick. And one of the things that again amazes me is the way that going back a little while, pension freedoms. The government has got a real kicking for this, because a lot of people reckon that actually introducing pension freedoms has resulted in poor practice, DB transfers, etc. Well, that's total and utter nonsense. Philosophically, pension freedoms are a fantastic idea for many, many people. It's just that some people have abused pension freedoms on an absolutely industrial scale. To quote a name, Bartholomew Hawkins went into liquidation this week. They were, I understand, one of the firms involved down at Port Talbot. Now, again, what hugely infuriates me is that we are no longer now authorised to do DB transfers. We were offered PI cover to do it, but the cost was just frankly ridiculous compared to the number that we did. We probably have done, I think, 14 over the course of the last 6 years, all of them for very good reasons. But and taking into account that the planning opportunities afforded by pension freedoms is great. Good idea by the government in my book. Some people have used and abused it on an industrial scale. That absolutely, coming back to Phil's point, number one priority should be stopping this kind of thing.
Got one more question in from the audience, so thanks again for that. From our good friend Anthony Morrow. Most customers haven't got a clue what the FSCS is, but they will expect any wrongdoing to be suitably compensated for, regardless of what that is called, whether it's insurance, cash savings, vouchers, or the FSCS. And does that say something about the future of the quantum of bills and self-regulation and all the other debates?
The interesting point there, I think, is the use of the word wrongdoing. PI cover is there to cover errors and omissions that we're all potentially liable to because we're human beings at the end of the day. There's a real difference between a mistake and a deliberate wrongdoing. That's the key thing I would highlight. Well, no one's perfect, but there's a real difference between using and abusing on an industrial scale and making the odd.
I think it's also raises the question of the interaction between the different types of protection that consumers get. So PI insurance is, as David's just said, that errors and omission insurance, but we're also required to hold on to enormous amounts of capital. It don't do us any good at all to make sure that we can continue as a firm. And then there's the financial services compensation scheme on top of that. So there's a kind of triple layer of protection for the consumer against errors and omissions. I just think the whole thing needs to rethink about what the expectations of both the regulator and the consumer are in this respect. It's onerous, and I think that needs addressing.
And Phil might, want to pick up on that because you just mentioned capital adequacy there, Nick. And one of my understandings, Phil, is that one of the things the regulator's looking at is lifting capital adequacy. Now, that obviously is going to cause problems for the smaller firm, for the startup firm. I would love to see more smaller, good quality firms. I take the view that actually owner-managed business is perhaps a far better security for the client. I'm well aware that some practitioners have done some very bad things as owner managers, but this again is an unintended consequence. Raising capital adequacy is not necessarily the best way forwards. A lot of the consolidators, who are the ones who I don't think particularly are acting in the client's best interest, they are the ones who can afford capital adequacy. Firms of our size and Nick's size perhaps haven't got a problem, but it will preclude an awful lot of good practitioners starting up and doing their own thing independently.
Yeah, Dave, you're exactly right. This is something that the regulators is issued this call for input, and part of that is to try and identify whether firms that represent higher risk should have extra requirements on that, and that could include an increased capital adequacy requirement. But it sounds great in concept, but a couple of challenges. First one, which you touched on, but some of the other ones are in terms of, in order to identify whether a firm is doing higher risk stuff, you have to collect more data. So you have to make that part of the regulatory reporting, which takes quite a lot of time to do, a lot of time and cost for lots of firms to do that. But another challenge, which is, once you start to push that through, what does that resultant impact mean in terms of FCA fees? Because again, I think we need to delineate between FCA fees and FSCS levies, because that can have a consequential impact there. So I think one of the things with CAP-AD, it sounds great in concept in terms of pushing that bar up, but in reality, and we've seen it when they have changed capital adequacy requirements, they're quite costly to do because every firm has to do something. The other thing as well with CAP-AD is it takes a long time to implement. We think the last time they changed it for SIP firms, it was about 6 or 7 years before it came through. Again, for advice firms, again, it was another long period of time. So it may be one of the tools that's available to them, but I don't think it's anything that's going to fix a problem short term. So it might be a longer term one, but it certainly won't get us out where we are now in the short term.
It made reference there to data collection. I mean, we've now done 5 different data sets for the regulator this year so far. So we had two Gabriel returns, two COVID-19 returns, and a DB transfer return. Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, that's kind of, we need another 7 returns to put in. So we got 1 a month going on here. It's just like, what are they doing with the data?
So this kind of goes back to the point that I sort of tried to make at the beginning, and it's almost, and it goes back to the fact that I sort of feel for the last couple of years people have been trying to answer the wrong question, because you have to accept, right? You have to accept that if you want a different construction of the levy, then you have to, and you want a levy that recognizes risk and drives the bad players out, you have to accept that part of that, and implicit in that is that the regulator has more oversight over your business. And that is either through sort of crude methods like data collection, or if you want to avoid that, then you have to accept things like holding more capital adequacy, which my personal view is doesn't actually capture risk at all. I think it's actually a very inefficient thing, and doesn't sort of do anyone sort of any good whatsoever. Nor does it sort of signify the fact that a business that has a lot of capital adequacy necessarily doesn't pose any risk whatsoever. But ultimately, this is the question that the industry as a whole has to ask itself and come up with an answer for, right? And as sort of representatives of the industry, and I understand that it's incredibly easy for me to tell people of the hard choices they have to do to run their business. I'm an incredibly unambitious man who hasn't got an entrepreneurial bone in my body. But these are the questions, right? And you have to decide whether or not you want the regulator to be more intrusive, you want it to be able to collect more data, or you basically just want to hold more cash. Because there is no perfect answer.
Yeah, let's take that risk point as one of the key solutions that has been mooted for this. By a show of hands, I want to do a series of these to see where our panel sits on whether or not we would introduce a risk-based levy. So the FCA collects data, and the more non-vanilla stuff you do, the higher your contribution to the FSCS. If you agree with that, raise your hand. We've got
sort of to an extent, really. I think it depends on your own credentials as well. You know, are you qualified in those high risk areas? You know,
I think define vanilla as well, and it's kind of, as we touched on this point around kind of how far back in time you have to go and look. But I think if we turn the clock back about 6 or 7 years, then you'd have looked at the top-selling fund manager at the time, Mr. Woodford, and thought, yeah, that's a great idea. No issues with anyone investing in that whatsoever. So there's a real kind of issue around kind of hindsight around all of this, I think.
Yeah. If somebody's ethical and applying, you know, they've got the knowledge, they're applying it in the right way, you know, it may well not be high risk. You know, you can't really, I don't think, align high risk necessarily to product. The essence of good advice is you understand the advice that you're giving, and the ethics are that you're applying it in the right place with the right client. You know, high risk in the regulator's view is purely product based. I don't think that's right. I think it's high risk. If anything is high risk, if people don't understand that particular field of advice.
I think you're right, Dave. And I think just to tap on that, it's the quality of the controls as well. You're right. It's the quality of the people giving the advice. It's also the quality of the controls that, you're right, can mitigate a perceived high risk investment. It's something actually, it's high risk because firms don't do it a lot. But if you're a firm that specialises in that particular area or that particular client type, actually you are doing it all the time. So I think you're right. It can't be quite a blunt instrument of just each product is high risk, therefore more capital. I think it needs to be a bit more holistic review.
You know, and, I've got to mention this because I just find it highly amusing. You know, when we were offered PI cover for DB transfers last year, the premium actually went up because we haven't done enough of them. You know, we have got a huge number of qualified, properly qualified, chartered financial planners who fully understand what it is they're doing. Absolute nonsense that the premium should have gone up because we haven't done more than about, well, I think it was 14 in 6 years. You know, that doesn't make us higher risk in my view. It doesn't make DB transfers high risk because we're doing them in the right way.
And that's where I think you end up with almost this Goldilocks solution, which is actually you can't do too few and you can't do too many. You need to be doing just about the right number. But where those boundaries are is a challenge.
Yeah.
What about a product levy then? So by that I mean where the price of whatever product it is that you're selling, you add an extra point whatever % to it that is added on and fielded by the consumer, and then that is what goes into the pot to fund the financial services compensation scheme. You could have
I think that's incredibly logical, but I don't think there's any evidence that the regulator's got any kind of appetite for doing that. It's just constantly that's been batted back, hasn't it? Every time it's suggested as a viable alternative, it's kind of in the too hard to do column.
But speaking as a planner, anything that puts the levy onto the product rather than the advice, obviously, all in favour.
What about the principle, though, that it shifts the responsibility for bad advice? Essentially, even if it's point whatever %, it's the consumer that's now paying for that.
It's the consumer that's paying for all of it. We know this, don't we? So, you know, when we're talking about these levies, and we have to reflect that back in the price we charge the customer, the consumer. So, consumer always pays.
You know, and again, that's another unintended consequence, because the regulator is very keen, obviously, for mass market advice. You know, and again, that just doesn't fit with this regulatory problem we've got, and with increased costs. Nick's absolutely right. You know,
and that question was posed, Dave, right at the front end of the call for input. You know, why is there a lack of appetite on the part of on the part of advisors to get involved in this mass market and deliver a low cost solution? Well, the answer is it's not profitable to do that. It's you know, the costs are so enormous. I sat down and worked out to just cover the cost of our PI insurance premium this year and the financial services compensation scheme, we'd have to be doing something like 1,750 low value pieces of advice if the price for it was about 500 quid. And I haven't got the resources to do that. We could use technology, but we simply couldn't deliver that. So it's strange that the regulator is asking us these questions when actually they're part of the root cause of the problem.
Yeah, and similarly, going back to my DB transfer point, I did exactly the same exercise. If we'd taken on the cover that we were offered, we'd have been probably £30,000 on every DB transfer case for it to make logical commercial sense. You know, crazy.
I think there's got to be a bit of a reality check around what the FCA's remit in total around all of this is. So a lot of the stuff around call for input is looking at their responsibility to regulate the population as a whole and identifying problems which undoubtedly exist there. But I don't think they're expecting the advice sector to necessarily solve that issue. We've done research for a number of clients in the past, and it's something like 4 or 5% of the population actually worked with a financial advisor. And absolutely, we've talked about kind of how those people need to be regulated, but there's a vast swathe of people who are going to go nowhere near a financial advice product or service in it anyway. And obviously, the regulator is devoting an enormous amount of time and attention at the moment to regulating the credit industry, mortgage holidays, and all of that type of stuff. But it's that question around the advice gap and where, if I'm only wanting to do £100 a month ISA, where I can go to get some sort of advice and the benefits that we talk about comes from. I think undoubtedly that's a huge question. I think the regulator is right to pose it, but I think I completely agree with Nick and Dave. I don't think that's you're not paid to deliver social policy and to get the whole population saving. You run businesses, and it makes sense that you look at where the demand for your advice is great and serve those clients accordingly.
But coming back to Justin's 2 points that he's just made, what I do think is the regulator probably needs to recognise that there are two different markets here. Mass market advice probably doesn't actually need too much input from a experienced qualified financial planner. That's not disparaging, it's just that some clients are not that complicated yet. Maybe what the regulator needs to do is focus on product regulation for that sort of area, so that anyone literally buying something without advice can be pretty sure that it meets certain standards. We went some way down that line with things like stakeholder.
It's a chicken and egg though, isn't it? Because it needs the resources to be able to regulate the products effectively, but those have got to come from the advisor bills at the moment.
Yeah, but that it's not right to focus on the advice in that situation, whereas the more perhaps complicated situation where the advice needs to be regulated is on those more complex areas where actually the advice is playing a role, because we cannot commercially get involved in smaller value investments, regular premium ISAs, regular premium insurance policies. Some of these things are hugely important to many people. We'll occasionally do this kind of thing as a favour perhaps to a grandchild of a client or something similar like that, but we've got to be really careful how we do that. I think there are probably the scope for product regulation in one part of the market, but advice regulation on the other side of it.
But again, defending the regulator around this, and again, I completely agree with everything you're saying there, but if you go and Google stocks and shares ISA now, because you've discovered that, that nice man Dave unfortunately can't help me, so I'll go online and do it myself. You Google stocks and shares ISA, you are in the Wild West there in terms of Google ads. And God help you if you click on any of the ads there, unless they're clients. But God help you if you click on any of the Google ads there to go in and buy a stocks and shares ISA. And I mean, two issues for the regulator there. Firstly, this is outside their regulatory perimeter, so there's not a lot they can do with these companies in terms of holding them to account. And it's like a horrible whack-a-mole for them. Every week they tweet out warnings, and they've done over 1,000 individual warnings so far this year. But the second point is they're having to actually buy up Google ads themselves around all of that. So they're having to pay Google to put a warning there of these ads are probably scumbags, don't click on them, that type of thing. So it's a double whammy for the regulator and a double whammy for firms who are funding the regulator as well. And that's where it goes beyond the guys in Stratford that need to solve this. This is into Treasury, this is into government. People need to sort their out, and way beyond the regulator.
It's absolutely a Treasury issue, and it's one of the reasons why we PIMFA are looking to put financial crime in sort of the forthcoming online harms bill, which currently doesn't recognise the issues raised through Instagram, Google, etc., sort of when Googling potential sort of financial products. I need to jump off because I've just been called early for a board meeting. But just one, I'm really sorry about that. But just sort of one of the points that I would like to kind of close on is around sort of the call for input, and in particular sort of what the mass market consumer needs in terms of advice. And I completely sort of agree with all of the points made, but I think one of the things that maybe this industry does sort of need to recognize is that the client of today will look very different to the client of 20 years' time, and they will have less wealth. They won't have as big a sort of pension. They probably won't access financial advice until the point at which their parents die. And this is a major sort of challenge for this sort of industry about sort of regenerating and sort of being able to offer a service which is both profitable to you, the business, but also sort of worthwhile to the client, because otherwise this industry will be swallowed up by Vanguard trackers. And that isn't a good state of affairs for anyone. So yes, thank you very much for sort of having me today. So sorry to have jumped off 20 minutes sooner than I should have.
No problem at all. Thanks so much, Sam.
Thanks. Thanks.
That does raise an interesting point when we were talking about the product regulation as well, about where coverage for the FCA and the FSCS bills starts and stops. Because if you look at something like London Capital and Finance, the mini bond provider, you're now getting claims to the FSCS even though that mini bond itself is not regulated. Why? Because if you have a regulated advice, if you met the conditions of being given personalised advice on a product, regardless of whether or not that's an unregulated one, you're still going to get covered. Do we just take, even if it's from a regulated advisor, say that if it was an unregulated product, no FSCS coverage?
It works as a solution.
Yeah.
And again, I think walking through what Dave was saying there about kind of, you've got mass market advice, you've got sophisticated financial advice. There's possibly one above that, which is almost just some guidance, some basic rule of thumb. And it might be through that, either pay down your debt, get some emergency cash, and you've probably lost most of the people through that filter. When you get people into that kind of mass market space, there's potentially an argument that says they shouldn't have access to unregulated advice. Sorry, unregulated products, sorry. So actually, there's something that the regulator could do in the construct that says you can't put an unregulated investment in a tax wrapper. So you can't have it in your pension. You can't have it in your ISA. And then if there's some education around that, people have to kind of get through maxing out their pension and maxing out their ISA before they can move into the unregulated world. And by that stage, they've probably got enough disposable income that they'll probably want some sophisticated advice. So there might be a way that you can do it, that you kind of create clearer barriers and clearer boundaries between people that just need a nudge in the right direction. They don't need a product. They need debt counselling, and they need something to steer them towards, put some money in the bank. The next one is, here's some sorts of things. Here's picking up on your point, Mike. Here's some kind of generic vanilla stocks and shares ISAs. Here's the characteristics to look for, whether it's a kite mark, whatever it might be. And then once you get into kind of full fat financial advice, that's when the more esoteric investments can come into play.
I think as much as I'm going to moan and grouse about the cost of the financial services compensation scheme, I think we have to be very, very careful about removing a protection from consumers who don't understand as much as we understand about these things. But I think if it was done in the structured way that Philip has just described there, that start off by not allowing unregulated investments inside those tax wrappers, you're right. I think most people then would be protected. There would still be the villains out there who go along and try and do it, but at least then it would be seen as a scam, and the regulator could take suitable action against them. But yeah, I think as long as it's structured properly and we're not just throwing people to the wolves effectively.
I wouldn't disagree with that. Yeah, it makes sense to me.
I guess the only thing it strikes me is maybe that we're kind of going down the path here of having a discussion around financial education. I'd agree with, I think, what Phil was hinting at. There's a couple of stages you need to go through before having this process in place and having a complete ban on unregulated investments. I can remember at the Landcap we had a similar webinar which we did, which obviously wasn't as good as this one, but almost as much fun, with Darren Cook, who does a lot of work around scams and was in part responsible for the ban on pension cold calling. And he made a point that which really resonated with me, that a lot of these people at the end of it, these criminals at the end of it, they're not stupid. They're not waking up and thinking, oh well, shall I just do this and see what happens? They're targeting people and doing these services because they know it's a good way to make money. It's a good way to invest their time.
That's the problem, isn't it?
That's the problem. As much as it's exactly what Nick said. In our world, we know what's going on, and if somebody, one of my friends says to me, "Can you recommend a good financial advisor?" Pretty much wherever they are in the country, I know where that I can find that. But if you don't have, if you're fortunate enough not to have people who are working like financial services as friends, then where do you go to find that? As I said a moment ago, if you start Googling it, which is what everybody does these days when they want to work something out for themselves, you're in a real horrible place fairly quickly around some of that.
I'm just disappointed
scam, as they say.
I was just disappointed that Mike didn't use the word scumbag once in that piece. Then. really sad.
But it is true, unfortunately, create a whitelist or any additional qualification or disclosure, all these other ideas that people have come up with. At the end of the day, if you're a determined fraudster, you're going to tick whatever box is going to need, and then you're just going to play around the edges. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so any further questions from the floor, do stick them in the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll pick them up. I think we should just go around the panel, just to round off. Maybe look forward 5 years or something like that. What would you like to see, and where do you think that we'll actually end up being when your FCA bill hits the desk? Can we start with you, Dave?
5 years' time, hopefully I'll be retired and I won't be worrying too much about any of this anymore. But no, seriously, what I sort of said when I joined this, I wouldn't quite call it a profession yet. I come at this, as I say, from the background of being a chartered accountant, but what I have seen is a real profession emerge. I would like to see that really carry on. I would like to see the qualification benchmark raised. I would like to see a lot less consolidation, but I do fear for the future of the small firm. I'd like to see the profession emerge and become trusted in the same way that most accountants and lawyers are perhaps trusted. And I would hope if we get there, the costs of running a business actually will become much more proportionate.
I tend to agree with that, Justin. I think Dave's got a good point there. I think this is, for a long time, well, since 2004 when we applied for and got chartered status for financial planners, I think we've been growing as a profession. I look around at the young people in my firm and think, the work that we put in over those years, they're going to inherit that. They're going to take it on to that level that Dave describes, where a chartered financial planner is seen as a professional person that is trustworthy and will do what they say they're going to do, and will add value to a consumer's life. And again, like Dave, if I'm having this kind of conversation with you in 5 years' time, my personal financial planning went badly wrong, and I have to find something to get some compensation from.
I think from my perspective, trying to look forward 5 years, I think what should have happened by then is we've been all the way through. The outcome of pharma would have been concluded. The work it's doing on the call for input should have concluded. We should have clarity about HMT accountability for the FCA. The FCA should have also completed its own transformation program about trying to be more effective and efficient. So hopefully off the back of all of that, from kind of the push down rather than the pull up, you should then have a regulator that's focused on outcomes. It's less concerned about the minutiae of the rules. It's less concerned about individual suitability on a specific file and is everything documented on it. It's up in proposition level. What's your proposition? How are you designing it? Is it designed to give good outcomes? And then above that, have you got the right product governance arrangements? Have you got the right culture and purpose in place to manage that? And I think if we get the regulator supervising firms at that level, that today's kind of utopia about kind of that self-regulation, it might feel a bit more like self-regulation because you've got more freedom to operate with your own propositions with that higher level, more subjective regulator.
I think for me, I've got kind of three things I've scribbled down on my wish list for 5 years' time. So I'd like the regulator to give offshore tax status to the Isle of Wight for anybody on that would be extremely nice. I think within the advice planning sector, I'd like to see some of the promise that is starting to come through, particularly from the next gen group, to actually be realised and delivered throughout the sector and delivered through to the end client. Apart from the fact that when I kind of look at those guys, I start to feel old. The way they talk about technology, the way they talk about culture, and the real consistent and continuous drive for professionalism and delivering the best possible outcome is a breath of fresh air, and I think that I think it's already delivering good outcomes for clients, and I'd like to see a lot more of that. The third thing, finally, to get rid of all the scumbags, which I'm sure Nick would be as well. So, yeah, fairly simplistic view from over here.
Brilliant. That takes us bang on to 1/2 So thanks everyone for joining us. It's been really interesting for me as well, so I appreciate it. Kick back to you, Alistair.
Yeah, just echo that. Thanks to all the panelists for your time today. Really interesting views. Clearly, it's not a particularly straightforward subject, and there's no easy answers to this conundrum that we're in. But yeah, thanks once again to everybody. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, all.
Cheers.
Yes.
Cheers.